In this tutorial, we're going to get more in depth with the static mesh workflow. Alright, so in between lessons I went ahead and I added those windows into our scene. So I just made copies of this window into that one, or those two. And then here with this window, notice the value that I input in my X direction to get that to snap in there properly. That is at 1.25. Now, if you're working on your own, it might be a little bit different if your values aren't exactly the same as mine. Okay, so if you want, you can take a look and open up the file for this lesson and take a look at that if you like. Okay, so now that I have these windows in, I want to talk about how we can manipulate these windows to get them to fit in this smaller space. Well, what we'll have to do is we'll have to just kind of move them in and space them a little bit different and scale them a little bit differently. So I'm going to make a copy of this window, and I'm going to hold down Alt and duplicate that in the Y direction. I'm just going to place that right up in there, and then I'm going to hit the space bar to go to my rotate tool and rotate that 90 degrees. Let's go to our move tool again, and in my front view, just want to take a look at this. I want to kind of get this lined up the best that I can. Okay, and you'll notice that it's not really snapping to the grid all that well. Let's go ahead and decrease our amount to 4, and let's see if we can get that to snap a little bit better to those walls, and that seems to work pretty well. Okay, so now that I have this, I've got quite a bit left on here. So what I need to do is I need to take these values out. I'm going to go ahead and take that to 1, and then in my Y, okay, let's go ahead and go to our local, and actually it's going to be our Z direction because I want to scale up to get this to fit in here. So in my Z direction, I'm going to go ahead and start out with some of those values. So let's start out with our base values. Let's type in 0.75, and I know that that's going to be a little too large right there already, just looking at that, trying to eyeball it. So I'm going to go ahead and type in 0.5, and that's a little bit closer. Let's go ahead and try to scale this up in there, and again, that's a little bit too large. Okay, that's not quite there. So we need just a little bit more than 0.5 and less than 0.75. So taking those safe values, you can kind of start to play around with those. And this might be a good idea to go ahead and have something like a calculator on hand here. So if I clear this out and I type in 0.5, which is what I have, and I'm going to go ahead and add one of those safe values. So I'm going to go ahead and type in, let's do 0.0625. And that's going to give me 0.5625. So let's input that value. So 0.5625. And that's going to get us closer. But again, I don't think that's quite it. Getting very, very close. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my values here. I'm just going to type in 0.5. I know what I need to input now. So I'm going to add 0.125 to that. So let's bring up our calculator. And we're going to clear this out. We're going to do 0.5 plus 0.125. And that's going to give us 0.625. Okay, so let's type that value in, 0.625. And I think that's going to be our magic number here. So that's kind of the workflow that I use for scaling geometry like this. Now, if I've adhered to the grid, these values will work. And this is going to be a really key tool for you whenever working in UDK. So now I have this set, but notice my windows are a little off. I don't really like how they are. They're not quite as square. So I'm going to scale these in my X direction as well. So looking at my X value, I'm going to type in 0.5 and see what that gives me. That's pretty close, but not quite. Let's type in 0.625, and that gives me those square windows. Okay, and I could still block that in on my grid. So this is kind of modularity, where we're going to be duplicating these and snapping those together, and they're going to meet up end to end. So if I come into my front view, okay, let me hit Control Z there. If I come in here to my front view and I hold down Alt and left click and drag that, notice how that snaps perfectly on that grid point. Okay, now notice that I'm under the drag units of 4, so that's going to help out as well. Now if you want to take that up a little bit higher, you can do so, but that might get you a little bit away from your grid. Let's hold down Alt, left click and drag that. Now we're starting to get into an area where we can't really see our object because the wireframe is becoming a little convoluted there, so a little tough to see. So then I'm going to hold down Alt, I'm going to drag, bring in this window, and then we need one more. Okay, so Alt, left click and drag, and plop that right in there. Now we're going to go end to end, but one thing that you'll notice is that it's kind of cutting through. It's not meeting up right here at this end perfectly. Now why is that? Well, we adhered to our grid, but sometimes that just doesn't work out. Now if it goes inside a wall like this, that is perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and leave it just the way it is. We can always cover that up if we want to with something like foliage or something like that. Remember that level design, there are no rules to it. Okay, you just need to follow the simple guidelines of staying on the grid, make it look pretty, and if there are some areas that can be covered up and with other objects and you can mix and match objects, nothing wrong with that. You're going to see throughout this process, and you're going to notice those areas, and you might think less of me because you might think that I'm trying to trick you or something like that with level design, but this is really how the professionals do it. If there's an area that just doesn't look good, you might just cover it up with a decal or cover it up with another static mesh. Okay, nothing wrong with that. All right, so now that I have these windows set up in here, we can come in and we can duplicate these windows, okay, and we can start to lay those across the side. Now I'm going to wait on those. You could do that in between lessons. Now what I want to do at this point is I want to come in and I want to add some glass to these objects. Now I can go to my content browser, and in here you can see that I have some broken glass and things like that. I even have some right here. Now you'll notice that we have this little icon in the left hand corner of the static mesh. This means that this is not fully loaded. So to fully load your meshes, you need to right click on your folder that you want to load and simply hit fully load. It's going to load in all of our packages, and that way we can see those and bring those in a little bit quicker. Okay. Now it might make your editor run a little bit slower, but it's really not that big a deal. Now here you can see that my static meshes showed up. So here I can left click and drag this in. You see that I have a very large piece of glass that I can rotate 90 degrees and put that into position and fit along my glass here. So I can grab my move tool, I can pull this up here, and if I need to, come into my front view and try to match this up a little bit better here. So if you want, you can take the same values that you had with your window here. So 0.625 is what we had, so I'm going to select that and go to local, and in my Z I'm going to type in 0.625. That's going to squash that down. Let's do the same thing in our X, so 0.625. And then I'm just going to place this in a position. I'm going to switch this over to world. Okay, and then hold down Alt, left click and drag, and we can add in these glass pieces here. Now you can do broken glass or you can do regular glass. It doesn't really matter at this point. Okay. Now one thing that you'll want to check before you move on too far is you want to check your placement in your top view. So I tend to get ahead of myself sometimes. So I'm just going to snap this to where it's in the middle, and if it's not showing up in the middle, just simply change your grid units to be a little bit smaller, and then that shall show up there. Alright, so now with all of those selected, I'm just going to simply hold down Alt, left click and drag those into place. So go into my top view, and let me go to my front view here and make this a little bit easier. I'm going to go ahead and bring this right out to this edge here. And that works out perfectly. So now I have a bunch of broken glass in the top of my area, okay, in my windows and things like that. Now if you want, you could use a different static mesh, kind of break that up with some different glass. This is a little bit more chunkier. It's not quite as broken like that. And this is complete glass. So if you want to bring that in, you can do so as well. So in between lessons, go ahead and fill those areas with glass. Go ahead and copy those frames from up here and put those on each side. And in our next lesson, we're going to continue on. We're going to start adding more static meshes to the exterior of our building. And I'll see you then.